All right, everyone. Welcome to Andrew and I's or Outreach Debates Disclose All Evidence Theory lecture. Um, I think we don't have a lot of slides prepared for today because we realized that the structure of the shell is very much similar to a generic disclosure shell. So I think the format we're thinking about is really just walking you through. Like I have like the doc of the shell pulled up right now, and we're just gonna walk through like every single part of it. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Um, so, all right, wait, can everyone see this? Wow, okay, perfect. I think Andrew nodded. Um, okay, thank you. So to start, like you have all the basic like nonsense in the interp. It's just like all the specifics like varsity equivalent pool, TOT bid tournament. For last year, we like even though the spread is a norm this year at I think yeah at season opener and kind of spread after that. The first time we ran this was at Emory. It was Emory last year. It was a very poorly written, poorly drilled out shell. So we had like a 0% win rate. Um, and we did not do very well at Emory, partly because of this. But so we've improved the interp a bit. I think like this is pretty generic. I think we've capitalized all to emphasize not just like evidence read and constructive. Um, I really don't know. Did we even hit this team? I don't know why there's a random screenshot in here, but the violation. So I think this is where it starts diverging from normal like constructive disclosure because with constructive disclosure, people most of the time won't contest like, oh, people won't say like, oh, I have not read any evidence in constructive. But whereas with rebuttals, those types of speeches are a lot more blippy and a lot more analytical, and it's kind of like more people will send like evidence for constructive in the email chain rather than the rebuttal. So I think like getting a clear violation is pretty crucial. So the strategy here is to like ask them in flex prep maybe before like let's say your second constructive. If they give first constructive, you'll ask them in flex prep before second constructive, have you read like evidence in rebuttal in previous rounds? If they say yeah, then you just pull up the screenshot of their wiki that does not have any rebuttal evidence marked in there, and then that's the violation. If they say like no, we haven't, then like fuck, I guess you're like and that's kind of more of a debate we'll get into later. But this part of the violation specifically is particularly important for the rebuttal disclosure shell, and it's kind of where a lot of the clash has been for a lot of like the all evidence disclosure rounds that I've heard of, and a lot of the ones that Andrew and I have debated. Standards, I think like these are pretty generic. Small schools. Um, I think like there's a bit of nuance in this one compared to regular constructed because it's kind of more about how like um more about like let's say for instance um that some team is reading like an abusive like offensive overview in the rebuttal speeches and just not disclosing it and they're just winning a tons of rounds off of it. Like the argument is that small schools that don't have the ability to go to these tournaments aren't able to access these like really well-written arguments or like abusive arguments that are read in the rebuttal speech because they aren't disclosed. So giving schools the ability to do this is, good for them. And then uh it's yeah, the link into like education and fairness is pretty much the same. Other than that. Uh Clash, I think this is like very similar to the nuance in the first standard. It's more about like things like score rebuttal strategies. For example, if I read like four diss ads in rebuttal every single round, other teams probably won't have a way of checking back on that or won't have a way of like prepping that out unless I disclose them. So this is kind of where the nuance of rebuttal disclosure or disclosure in all speeches of the round kind of distinguishes itself from regular constructive disclosure, which is also a pretty big part of the shell. Andrew, do you want to take the next two standards?
Um, yeah. Argument depth is pretty intuitive. It's just says like if you disclose rebuttal responses, then people are more likely to see the flaws in constructive arguments, which means that there's a race to the top effect, in which people will start reading the best rebuttal responses. People will start having to think of the best front lines to deal with those rebuttal responses. And eventually, just like normal disclosure, you'll weed out all the bad responses. You'll end up promoting all the good responses. And hopefully, what that means is constructives will also get better and better because rebuttals are getting better and better. And then the fourth one of hiding evidence, I think, also very similar to the second standard of clash. It's just that if you don't disclose every speech, then you can put a carded rebuttal that's maybe abusive, horribly miscut, or even you can hide a card somewhere in the speech that your opponents aren't prepared for that kind of restarts the whole round. Um, Also, a lot of impact turns are primarily read in rebuttal. So if you read like, let's say, a bunch of constructive arguments and then decide to kind of restart the round in rebuttal with an impact turn like Spark, you obviously aren't going to know the evidence for that unless if the rebuttal evidence is disclosed. So that's kind of the second and the fourth one are very similar. It's just if you don't disclose 100% of evidence, then it's possible for teams to put overpowered arguments in rebuttal, or just to completely lie about arguments in rebuttal. And then everything else is very, very typical for any theory shell. Luke,
Yeah,
I
I
think you got
think.
it from here.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay. I might get a little confused from here on out, so I might have to take it back to you. But I think from the voters, like all these like paradigm issues are pretty generic. Like I think we have this in every show we run. If anyone has like questions about these who's like a little new to theory, we can go back to these like in the Q&A part of the lecture, but I'm just gonna skip over these for now. Okay, I think this is where it starts to get like pretty interesting. I'll ignore that down there. So this is like the underview that we read, and it's kind of to like like kind of a cop out of a lot of the generic responses that people will read to this. For example, if someone hears like a disclosure shell, the first instinct is probably to pull up like a disclosure bad shell or like turns on the shell. But the underview should kick out of a lot of these or respond to a lot of these because the underview is basically saying that like all of their offense or all of their responses need to distinguish how their standard of like constructive disclosure um how their responses don't apply to their like norm of constructive disclosure, but rather they only apply to things like rebuttal disclosure. And I think that like really pushing this in every single speech in the round will really like I think it's probably the best way to group a lot of the responses that people will read because Andrew and I's experience is that when people respond to a shell like all evidence, they typically don't distinguish the differences between their norm of constructive disclosure rather than like or in comparison to a more broad norm of like disclosing all evidence in all speeches and um I think like there's also a little just yeah, it's just to prefer non-arbitrary standards because it's better for norm setting, which is I think is also pretty strategic. Um, this is also pretty generic. Okay. Um, I think there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, but I forget. Uh, Oh yeah. I think so we'll get into the responses now. I think like okay, one, I think like the best way to respond to the shell is to just follow the norm, disclose all of your rebuttal arguments because um I think like it's generally a very good norm. I think actually it's all of the time a very good norm. Like it because like for me and Andrew who come from a small school that from a program that we started our freshman year, so this is our third year in the like in our program at our school. I think, running this shell and like spreading the norm throughout the entire circuit, which I think we've done a decent job at, has really helped it make the debate space a lot more accessible for Andrew and I, but also for a lot of other small schools that we know of. So I'd say like the best way to respond is just disclose your rebuttal evidence and or like all of your evidence that you read in the round. So let's say you read like carded wing and summary, that also needs to be disclosed. But I think like I don't think it's that big of a competitive disadvantage either. Like, I can't remember a round where Andrew and I have like disclosed something in rebuttal and like we've just gotten like destroyed for it. But I don't think that's like really ever happened to us. So like for people that are afraid of like, if I disclose, I don't know, if I disclose my like shitty blocks on the wiki, like what if people prep them out? Like I don't think that's that big of a deal. But if you want to get more if you like really, really hate this norm and you really, really don't want to follow it, then like there's probably two routes you could follow. The first is to just like delete your entire wiki and then disclose at all. And then kind of just run disclosure bad, which I think like is generally really, really unstrategic now because a lot of people will just hack for disclosure good or will be more inclined to vote for disclosure good. I think the second route is to kind of read like meta theory on this, right? And I think a good example is one that Andrew and I hit at UK season opener Octas this year. Um, and is it Octas? Oh, I think he's busy. Yeah, I think we hit it at Octas, but a team ran a shell about out of round violations, and I think like also talking about the verifiability on the violation because it's kind of hard to prove that someone has read rebuttal evidence, right? For example, I could like fabricate an email chain and say like, oh, look, here are you. Like I could get their emails from the wiki, make an email chain and say, look, these are your emails emailing us, no, like zero rebuttal, or like these are your emails from a previous round, that has not sent, or that has like sent rebuttal evidence in this email chain, but is not disclosed on the wiki. So teams can like kind of make these arguments that says like there's no way to verify anything. Screenshots can be doctored. Like I can like inspect element like the wiki, or I can inspect element like my Gmail to show that you didn't read any rebuttal evidence or you didn't disclose any rebuttal evidence. So they could say that like these types of violations are arbitrary, so we shouldn't care about out of round violations. And generally, I think, all right, someone's requesting remote control of my screen. Um, I think generally like this is probably a pretty good way to do it, but like for a lot of judges, for example, like this team ran this on like Shane Stafford, which I wouldn't say is um probably the judge that's gonna be most inclined to vote for this argument. So I think in general, the PF circuit too is not going to be very willing to vote on these types of arguments because they generally believe that disclosure is good, and regardless of whether like they think the violation's a little arbitrary, um, it's probably like they probably did violate. Um, Andrew, you got anything?
Yeah, I think like a very common thing that we see is most of the responses to a lot of the stuff that we point out in like the all evidence shell. Most of the responses can be applied to literally any disclosure shell, including constructive disclosure, which is kind of like not how you're supposed to respond to the shell. So, for example, the example that Luke brought up about like doctoring screenshots, obviously you could still do that even if someone's not disclosing normally and you're doing like constructive disclosure, right? So I think a lot of the responses that we've hit, or I'd say actually every response that we've hit, I've yet to see one that only applies to rebuttals and does not apply to constructives. And I think because of that, I think that like as long as there's this underview here that they disclosed like evidence in constructive, which means they should endorse the norm entirely or not endorse it at all. Um, I think that that's pretty much like good enough to win like 90% of the rounds that you have on here simply because if your opponents like want to go for another route like oh you doctor your screenshots or it's possible that people would doctor their screenshots again like you would just explain that why that would also apply to like constructive evidence or constructive disclosure and then that response wouldn't be sufficient to vote down your standard because they need to prove why their norm of only disclosing in an arbitrary number of speeches is good. And then with that point, I think what Luke said about reading meta theory is probably just the best way to respond. So critiquing the way that the shell is read instead of the actual standards of the shell, because I think that the standards are very hard to engage with simply because, in my opinion, you should just either do all or do none. So what that means is like teams have run like out of round shells are bad. So something completely independent from the disclosure debate and something that shifts it to whether you should be running theory on disclosure or not, I think is strategic and also gets out of the underview because it's just a critique of generally running disclosure theory and it doesn't need to be specific to the shell by any means. So I think that what Luke said is totally right. Either you delete your entire wiki page and talk about not disclosing at all, or if you want to disclose, then you just, if you still don't want to follow the norm, though, the best thing you can do is just critique the way that the theory is read in the first place. Um, Other than that, I think that like the standards specifically is just way too hard to find like a reason as to why only like disclosing constructive is like a good thing. I don't think that it's like the Goldilocks zone. A lot of people say that, but obviously they're just saying that because they don't want to follow the norm, and there's no warrant as to why it is the Goldilocks zone. I think one other thing that we've come across is like nobody does this in LD or nobody does this in other formats. The reason why LD doesn't do it is because the 1AR is like very short. So there's a lot of condensing that happens there. It's like basically public forums summary, I guess. So there's like 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and there's a 4 minute speech to condense the entire round. So a lot of the stuff read there isn't evidence based at all. And on the other side, like policy does do this because they also do have like a robust rebuttal speech in which it's a norm to introduce evidence after evidence after evidence, as it is in PF, which is why they also disclose all their evidence read. So I think like comparing it to other events also isn't really a response that's going to go anywhere. So all of that to just say, like, I think interacting with the standards on the shell specifically are actually very difficult. And I haven't seen any prep out that I would say is like one that is sufficient to beat the shell solely based on the content in the shell.
Yeah, you can beat like Andrew and I, but like I think the shell is pretty good. Um, I think one other thing that we've noticed and like that I've thought about a lot, but I haven't really like come up with a coherent answer to is the idea of like nitpicking, right? Like at first, I think like my understanding of disclosure is that like there was like, like first three, last three, which I think is like horrible. And then like people started like full texting, and then people started open sourcing, and then people started I guess people started disclosing all evidence, right? So there's kind of a progression, but people will argue that um like it's I forgot what the word is. It's like um Andrew, do you know what the word is? Like
Infinitely regressive.
yeah, infinitely regressive. Where people can just say like, oh, like for example, once like let's say disclosing all evidence becomes like every single team on the circuit discloses all evidence, right? People could then read a shell about like, oh, teams should disclose all analytics, right? And then people could argue that like your norm of like endlessly critiquing disclosure is infinitely regressive because people can find infinite reasons to somehow make like disclosure a little bit better, but it only like pushes out like substantive debate. And like um I think like the general response to like these types of arguments is that it's to kind of make your standards very specific to like evidence and how evidence, is a link to fairness or how evidence is a link to education, which I think is probably the best link. So for example, like this fourth standard about hiding evidence is pretty specific to evidence. So if someone says like, oh, why don't you disclose analytics? Like you could say our standards for disclosing all evidence is very specific to evidence, and we'd say that like I think that also the underview down here should kick out of it because um it isn't arbitrary. It's just talking about disclosing all of your evidence in every single speech. And there's already like a spike about like why our interp is non-arbitrary. Um, Regardless of that, I think this is a very, very short lecture because I think like this type of theory shell is basically just like it's literally just a construct like a regular Disclose shell, except with like t- more nuance as to like how it's a little different from regular constructive disclosure. Maybe it's more talking about like for example, pushes it like discourages squirrely rebuttal strats. But I think like a good like 70% at least of the shell is literally from like a regular constructive shell, and we've just modified it a little. So I think like if you have a decent understanding of constructive disclosure, and how to run like a normal Disclose shell pretty well, like you should have no problem reading this. Um, I think. Andrew, do you have anything else planned?
Yeah, I think what we were asked to do is like kind of explain this shell more specifically as like a specific type of argument and debate, not like theory generally. So if you have questions on that, obviously you're free to ask. But the reason why we're not talking about like all of disclosure is just because like this lecture is supposed to be just about this shell. And I think that that basically sums it up. Like it's very similar to a normal um it's very similar to normal like disclosure debate, and because of that, there's not much else that you need to do other than a make a distinction as to why disclosing in every speech is better than disclosing in an arbitrary number of speeches, and then obviously b also just making sure that you do like normal good theory debate throughout the round. So that means like collapsing on one standard instead of going for every standard, which happens all the time for no reason. And then making sure you weigh that one standard, contextualize it to the voters, extend your voters, extend all the paradigm issues like drop the debater, and make sure you're weighting those as well, obviously. And then by the end of the round, hopefully you have one standard that you're very comfortable going for. All of these standards are here because they're weighable. I think originally when we wrote the shell, there were like six or seven standards, but we condensed it down to the four standards that are actually weighable. The other ones were like, um, the other ones were very stupid. So because of that, you'll also see like the shell that we ran at UK is different than the shell we're running now because we just decided to pick out all the ones that were kind of like time sucks. So all of these are very weighable. And all you have to do is pick one, collapse, and then weigh it, and then it should be enough to win around.
Yeah. I think Andrew, I think Spectator had a question for you.
Um, okay. Is in the chat.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Um, I think I guess like I'd ask you to clarify what type of shell you're talking about. I think there's a lot of different like non-resolutional theory bad bait type shells, but usually, to be honest, it would just end up becoming coming down to a debate about that shell, right? So like if someone reads like a critique of non-resolutional based theory, obviously then you have to defend reading non-resolutional based theory, and that would just mean that the debate basically devolves down to that shell. And I think that it's like a very winnable shell, and it's also a very losable shell. So I'd say that that's probably the best strategy to beat any disclosure debate is to not actually engage in the disclosure stuff because most of the time you're going to lose it. Just in the current state of PF with all the judges hacking for disclosure, even though even I don't think that it's 100% perfect. And I don't think people should be hacking for it. But like, then again, I think that the best strategy is to just say, like, I know a lot of people read this as like out of round violations are bad because like they like expand the role. Like the judge now has like more power over what a debater can and cannot do, which kind of crosses into like dangerous territory. If a shell like that is run on you, then you have to actually engage with that shell. And then you're right, like it would just shift into a debate, like basically solely about that shell and defending the way that you're running theory instead of actually the specific content in the all evidence shell. So if you want to run something like this, just like if you were running normal disclosure, you would probably have to be pretty ready for that type of debate. Okay, if I have a
Oh,
history on
Vedant, Vedant has a question. If I have a history on my wiki of only disclosing constructive, can I just put a site saying I changed my norm? Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I think for sure. And I think like most of the interps on disclosure will say like you have to do it for like the current topic or something. And the reason why is just because it gives people the ability to change their norms. So it says like previously read evidence in round on the current topic, right? Some people would even say like in the current like tournament. The reason why we put the current topic is because all the educational benefits of debate are within the current topic of debate because nobody's like researching topics from the past. And even if they are, like the educational benefits of one team on the topic in the past is just so marginal that at that point, like it would just be like a really silly type of debate. So I think if you can just, if you want to, you don't even need to put up a site, in my opinion. But if you want to put up a site, you can just like, oh, I changed the norm for the April topic and all topics moving forward. And I will now be doing this norm from now on. Something like that is sufficient because obviously it meets your own interp of the current topic during season.
Wait,
Um,
low-key non-res theory bad because infinitely regressive, out-of-round violations, unverifiable, etc. is low-key true. The only answers are like theory debates good, non-res theory bad, except disclosure. Bro, bro, speak English. Wait, bro, I can't understand this. I don't think there's a coherent answer to non-res theory. Oh, okay. So I think like the way that me and Andrew kind of think about this is like, I think in cross we hit, yeah, some team ran this on us, and then um they said like, oh, like they were like, oh, so at what point does like can I like run theory on you for doing something outside of the round? And then I think like the way we explained it is like if you doing something outside of the round affects us in round, like if Andrew walks up to my laptop and like punches a hole through it like a minute before the round, like I should be able to read a shell on him for that, right? So if an action that someone does outside of the round affects you inside of the round, then um it should be able to do it. Wait, then tab solves.
Wait,
Um,
I think like what we're kind of saying is like, um, let's say like I don't know, I break Luke's glasses before the round or something like really dumb, right? Or like, let's say like, well, I think Luke said like I smashed like your computer or something. Like, obviously, there's certain practices out of the round that will be dictated. That will dictate how the round progresses. I think this argument about tab solves, like, sure you can bring it up, but like, where in tab room is there a rule that you like can't smash people's laptops, right? I think like after a certain point, like I agree, like maybe not all of like this out of like not all of non-resolutional theory is like good, but I think as long as like you also brought up, if we can defend disclosure specifically in the realm of non-resolutional theory, obviously I think that then it would be sufficient to defend our practice of reading this shell, and I don't think that that's too hard to win. Um, Maybe you think that there's no like coherent answer to non-resolutional theory, but I think it's because the way that you're reading the interp kind of groups everything. And our strategy to go about that is to point out a distinction between disclosure specifically and all other forms of non-resolutional theory. And if your argument is that then it like blurs the line, then people are going to like cross the line. Then like, I mean, again, that's something that you can defend, but I don't think that that argument is very persuasive in the current state of PF. And more specifically, I think that basically judges are becoming so like so much of a hack for disclosure that that type of argument is not the most strategic on like the majority of tech judges I'd say that you would see at any PF tournament.
yeah, they're so dogmatic. I agree. In response to all of this, though, what's the response to say that learning to respond is a critical portable skill which is unique to rebuttal? I think that also goes for like construct. Okay, yeah, spectators in disbelief. I think like this also applies to constructive disclosure. Like if you think about it, right? If I don't just like an argument that people will read for like disclose bad is like critical thinking because if I don't disclose any of my constructive arguments on the wiki, then teams are forced to respond on the fly when I read it in like the constructive speech in round. So I think like this kind of bites the underview where it's like they have it like you need to specify how it's unique to rebuttal because there's arguments that it's not unique to rebuttal.
Yeah, I think also
Well, good,
there's a
congrats,
bunch of
Cranbrook.
responses. Yeah, okay. Cranbrook one off, that's pretty cool. I think there's like a bunch of responses. I think for one, like to be honest, most people that compile block files are going to already pre-write all the responses. So the ground for like unknown arguments is already really small. And chances are, if it's an unknown argument, like you can still have unknown arguments after all evidence. In fact, I'd say that actually encourages more innovation because now there's a strategic incentive to have like arguments being written that nobody has ever heard about, which means that the variety of arguments might actually increase because of disclosure. So at the beginning of the topic, you're going to hear a bunch of new arguments because people now know that there's going to be prep outs that are being disclosed to their arguments. So they can't read like horrible arguments anymore, right? So there's a strategic incentive still for people to write new arguments, which you obviously have to respond to. And even then, like, I think a lot of people say like, oh, like you can't respond in the round, you're gonna not have a portable skill ever again. I'd say like even if you're responding 30 minutes before the round after the argument just got disclosed, like you're still using your brain. That's still critical thinking. Maybe you don't have the time pressure of like 1 minute of prep, but 30 minutes before the rounds to fully like flesh out like an argument is still a lot of critical thinking. And it's probably like super applicable to the real world as well. Um, Also, a lot of the time, what happens is like I'd say even the best debaters do not have like a million responses to every argument in 1 minute of prep. I mean, like I certainly am nowhere near that. So I'd say that a lot of this is kind of overestimating what debate trains you to do. I think instead people will just do a worse alternative.
Hey, Jaden. Thanks. Okay. All right, Andrew, continue.
Okay, I think like I think the worst alternative. Sorry, I think the worst alternative is just people. Sorry, sorry, people reading like. One sec. I think the worst alternative is people reading like generic like block file responses that don't actually apply to certain arguments because they haven't heard of them before and because they aren't able to think fast enough, which in my opinion just happens so much more of the time than like people being able to like spit out like 10 responses on the spot. So to answer this question, basically, like first of all, you're overestimating the ability of all debaters. Like debate trains you, yes, but it doesn't train you to completely dissect an unheard argument in like 2 minutes or in like I guess less than 2 minutes, like 30 seconds, right? Second of all, I think even if it did, the other standards are probably worse. For example, if someone could make up like a piece of evidence like from the other standards, I'd say that probably outweighs like this like critical like portable thinking skill, right? And third of all, even then, it's not like you're losing critical thinking because you can still critically think 30 minutes before the round. Now you're just prepared for what you're going to think about. And I really don't think that that's like substantially worse. Yeah.
All right, any other questions, friends? Um, can we have access to the master file? No, this doc is like empty. I don't think it'd be very useful.
Yeah. Anyone that needs it can like hire Luke Zhong for private coaching. So
Oh yeah,
he
wait.
will distribute it to you guys.
Yeah, my rates are pretty affordable. Um, any other questions? Sorry, this lecture was a little short. I understand everyone is very excited to learn about this, but um, if you win disclosure and a K team calls you racist, how do you weigh between the two? Um, Andrew, you want to take this one?
Um, I mean, wait, what care are you going to read disclosure on? And like, what's the warrant for why disclosure is racist? Like I know the argument exists for sure, but if you can give me the warrant for why that's true, like maybe I'll have a better time explaining.
Oh my God.
Okay. I'd say probably if they call you racist, I think you probably have to address that first, regardless of if you're reading theory or not. Um, and I also think like in the current state of PF, reading like um yeah, I'd say at that point, you should probably just interact with that layer of the flow.
Yeah, fairness, however.
Yeah, I think that
Um,
that's not really a winning argument in PF. I know that it's like definitely a very viable strategy in LD, but I think the reason why there's such a proliferation of K teams in PF is because a lot of judges are very inclined to vote for an argument that um, points out something like racism, and a lot of judges are not inclined to read vote for arguments as to why fairness outweighs. Um,
Yeah, that's a
Like it's the
good
same
point.
reason as to why like a lot of people would not read T against a non-T shell. The reason why is because they don't think they can win this fairness over like whatever the standard is debate. So I'd say like the same thing kind of applies there. Like if you're very drilled on T, obviously then you would have a better time of putting fairness first. But if you're not and you don't really know like how to weigh between the two, obviously you should probably address the K first. Especially just like in the current state of PF, like um yeah, I think maybe not all judges think that, but I'd say that most PF like tech judges that you will encounter definitely are inclined to vote one way over the other. Um, and that's just the way that PF is, in my opinion.
Um, any other questions, friends? I have the link to the doc. Just make it public. Hmm. Oh yeah, you do have the link. Uh, no, like this.
Okay, if you're looking for the doc, you can find it if you go to Florida Blue Key Round Robin Round Four versus Fairmont Prep, or
That was the last
what
time we
else?
read it, I think.
Oh, really?
I think so. Because our first turn, yeah, we had.
Yeah, I think after that, yeah.
Wait,
Florida
I'll pull it
Blue
up,
Key,
guys.
Florida Blue Key round robin round four against Fairmont Prep SK. I
Yeah, I
think
wrote it doc.
after that, every team that we've hit has either been on the way or has followed the norm. So I think, like to be honest, right now most teams are actually following this norm, or
Yeah,
they're not disclosing at all.
like this is literally just what's on the doc. Oh, I guess the interp is a little different.
Oh wait, we read it Harvard round two, I think, against Summit something.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
All right. Uh, yeah. So if you're looking to like access the actual text of the interp and like, well, actually the entire shell, and you want to run it for yourself, it's disclosed. And then, yeah, I think this is just exactly what we have in the doc. PDFs. Yeah, my bad, guys. Do you guys know
Yeah,
who?
I think um okay. I think our school actually doesn't do Word. And because of that, like if there was a Word doc, we would have to transfer it into Google Docs no matter what. So that's why we do PDFs because there's just no difference.
How do we best
Um,
K teams? Uh,
we just read a K back with them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, do I know who Lock Nguyen? I think I know him. Yeah. Oh, yeah, he's pretty chill. Okay, guys. Any questions? Previously read evidence even mean? Like if you I guess if you want to get into like a spirit over text debate, like I guess that's another route you could go, but um
Wait, the reason why is because like we it's supposed to be previously read evidence in round because some people will say like, oh, like I read this article like last night before going to bed. I never read it in a round, but I read this article like for fun. Do I need to disclose it? Or like I read this book for English class. Do I need to disclose that too? So we just did previously read evidence in round to like, kind of like discourage that type of like nitpicking of the interpretation.
thanks, Nikhil. Nikhil, you have any questions for us?
So many questions. Let's see. What do you do if somebody, how do you compare between like disclosing all evidence versus just disclosing like open source? Like, what if somebody says like open source is enough? Like what is
Oh,
it?
like
Well, I guess
so
it's the shell.
um yeah, I guess the warrants would need to be like pretty specific because the way that we've structured our shell is to kind of like outline how our shell is different from like generic constructive disclosure. And I think even though we don't like specifically mention um like even though we just don't specifically mention like open source disclosure in the shell, like you can see like for example, um maybe not that one. Uh, yeah, like I think for example with hiding evidence, like a potential flaw with only doing open source disclosure is that even if teams are disclosing like even like are disclosing like all of their evidence like cut card, it doesn't matter because they can still hide their like really good cut card evidence in rebuttal or just like make up evidence later on. So like um, for example, I can just disclose like some really horrible cards in constructive. Open source doesn't really matter, but I can like make up evidence in rebuttal and just hide it. Um,
What if somebody says like it's non-ver like the non-verifiability stuff? How do you and Andrew like answer the fact that like only rich teams are going to be able to check chains and get information about whether teams violate or not? So underfunded schools will still get like pushed out because either A, they don't have access to the wiki, or B, they don't have the connections to check back against like fake disclosure. Like if I just like say like I only read analytics when like I definitely did it, how do you like resolve or answer those like those claims?
Yeah, I think that's pretty tough, but I think like people might think that like find like scouting for email chains or like getting email chains from people might be a little hard, but I think me and Andrew like being able to run the shell pretty successfully this year at least should be able to like disprove that because we started our program our freshman year. We're juniors now, so like our third year we like I think I mean, there's like other like varsity teams at our school, but I think like generally like we're pretty much the only team at our school that competes nationally. And like for example, one round at Harvard, we just like I literally like emailed Brooke Blanton like, "Yo, can you send me this? Like email, can you send me like the email chain from like round three?" And then she sent it to us. So I think like you don't really need to have connections in order to do this. Like you just need to like I think it should be like decently easy because if you think about it, there's like five people in every round. So there's like a decent chance that at some point you'll know someone who was in that round or someone who knows someone that was in that round.
Yeah, and I also think that that type of response doesn't really take away from the merit of the interpretation specifically, because it's just about establishing the norm of people disclosing all previously read evidence. It's not like, oh, like we should be giving people that do it like a competitive advantage. So like even if smaller schools, even if it was true that it'd be harder for them to get a competitive edge off of running things like the shell off of them, hopefully after a certain point, people would be doing it enough so that like they know like at a tournament if they don't do it for every round some other like bigger school is going to call them out for it, so they just end up doing it for every round regardless.
Love it. This is why I like Germantown friends. They single-handedly kept me in the debate space because I was gonna quit because I had to cut cards, and now I haven't cut a card in like a year. So it's
Oh
amazing.
yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna leave.
By Nikhil. All right, does anybody have any last lingering thoughts?
Yeah, let's back. Everyone must disclose every piece of evidence that they've read, at least at that current topic. So not like just rebuttals, which I think is like people call this like rebuttal disclosure, but like it could be like, I don't know, summary disclosure too if you read carded weighing. Um, yeah. Slide the back, and we don't have any back files.
Yeah, we have no back files.
We have like our back files are from like 2023.
Yeah, we have back files of like what we cut freshman year, that's
Oh
it.
no. Mm, thanks, guys. Okay, if no one else has like any more questions, I think we can end it here, but our emails are on our wiki along with like a lot of other ways to contact us. So feel free to reach out at any point.